Hi there, good morning to Dr. Akmal and my fellow friends. My name is Mama Azimenon Zaini.
Hi, my name is Misha Eliana Michael.
Assalamualaikum and hi, my name is Nurul Shaniza binti Osman.
Hi, my name is Nur Shamila binti Muhammad Shukri.
Hi, my name is Siti Umira binti Sulaiman.
We will present our study on factor influencing consumer spending in Malaysia. This research examines how three key macroeconomic variables such as GDP growth rate, interest rate, and inflation rate that affect consumer spending, since household consumption account for over 57% of the Malaysia GDP. Understanding this factor is important for economic planning. Financial stress among Malaysians is rising. Nearly half are in the credit card debt and many young people have large unpaid loans. Most Malaysians also lack sufficient retirement savings. This trend highlights poor financial habit and the urgent needs to understand what drives consumer spending. This study asks, do GDP growth rate, inflation rate and interest rate significantly influence consumer spending in Malaysia? Our objective is to analyze this relationship using annual data from 1994 to 2024. This study focused on Malaysia and used 30 data points to examine these economic variables. Findings from this study are useful for researchers to support future economic studies, policymakers to guide fiscal decisions, and businesses to predict consumer demand shift. Limitations include reliance on the secondary data and a limited sample size, which may not reflect the long-term patterns.
So, firstly, this study aims to examine the factors that influence consumer spending in Malaysia. It considers both global and local contexts and uses the Keynesian consumption theory, where the consumption is a function of income, which is C equals to A plus BY. The study also looks into how GDP growth, inflation, and interest rate impact spending patterns. So now, we'll be looking into the economic situation worldwide. So, globally, GDP growth dropped to 2.6% to 3% in 2019 due to weak demand. Events like the trade war and Brexit created uncertainty and reduced spending. The OECD reported lower retail sales and higher saving. Lack of fiscal stimulus limited the multiplier effect, which the inflation reduced real income, and IMF project only 2.7% to 3.3% GDP growth by 2025. Next is consumer spending worldwide. So, spending was strong in pre-pandemic, with growth in e-commerce. While in 2020, COVID-19 shifted focus to essential goods and digital consumption. By 2022 to 2023, inflation pushed consumers toward value-based shopping, savings, and budgeting. While for the post-pandemic, trend shows interest in sustainability, wellness, and digital integration. While luxury and travel spending rebound temporarily. Next is consumer spending in Malaysia. In Malaysia, consumer spending drives GDP. When GDP rises, jobs and income increase, boosting confidence and spending. But weak GDP causes uncertainty and lower demand, inflation reducing purchasing power, especially for low-income group, who then focus on essential. Interest rate changes like lower OPL during COVID-19 affect loans and big-ticket purchases. So, next slide is relationship between factors and consumer spending. So, consumer spending is the dependent variable, which influenced by GDP growth, interest rate, and inflation rate, which are the independent variable. These factors interact to shape consumer behavior directly and indirectly. Understanding this relationship helps explain shift in demand and economic performance. For the GDP growth and consumer spending, higher GDP raises national income and promotes consumer spending. Research in West Africa confirms this positive link. In Malaysia, stable GDP boosts consumer confidence, FDI, employment, and wages, which reinforce spending behavior. Rising GDP reflects economic stability, which lead to higher household expenditures. Next is interest rate and consumer spending. According to the traditional monetary theory, interest rates and consumer spending are negatively related. Higher rates increases borrowing costs and reduce spending. Studies shows consumers cut back, but in Malaysia, cultural and habitual spending persists, especially for essential. This causes spending inertia, which weakens short-term interest rate effects. Lastly is inflation rate and consumer spending. In 2020, overall inflation fell by 1.2%, mainly due to drops in transport, housing, and also clothing prices, but essential items like food and beverage roses, affecting urban households. While inflation didn't have a direct impact on spending, it did reduce real disposable income, which adjustments are proposed to help sustain spending.
Moving on to Chapter 3, it focuses on the methodology employed in the study. It covers variables, data collection, research design, research framework, sampling design, test consideration, hypothesis statement, data sources, and also summary.
In this research, consumer spending in Malaysia is the dependent variables, meanwhile the independent variables are GDP growth rate, interest rate, and also inflation rate.
This study relies on secondary data chosen for its reliability and consistency. The study covers annual time series data from 1994 to 2025. Data were sourced from the reputable and publicly accessible platforms such as World Bank, Department of Statistics Malaysia, and also Trading Economics. This study used a casual research design to examine how GDP growth, interest rate, and inflation affect consumer spending in Malaysia. Using secondary data over 9 years, it involves no research interference, is set in a natural environment, and also focus on national level analysis through a longitudinal approach. The research framework is designed to illustrate the relationship between selected macroeconomic variables and consumer spending in Malaysia.
For the test consideration, we plan to use 11 tests on our model. For example, unit root test is used to assess whether a time series dataset is stationary or non-stationary, and the Rubin Watson test is employed to discover whether the errors produced by a regression model are correlated. Next, hypothesis statement. Now, hypothesis states there's no significant relationship between GDP growth, interest, or inflation rates and consumer spending, while alternative hypothesis suggests there is a significant relationship for each factor.
Next, I will explain about Chapter 4, which is data analysis. Overall, our model residuals shows a Jacobera p-value of 0.4827, which is well above 10% threshold, indicating the residuals are normally distributed. The histogram further supports this, showing a mean near 0, slight skewness, and kurtosis close to 3. Therefore, the model meets the overall normality assumptions, although GDP individually does not.
Correlation analysis. All variable pairs shows p-value greater than 0.05. This means we fail to reject the null hypothesis for each pair, indicating there is no significant correlation among the variables. Even the subpair shows moderate correlation, the results are insignificant. So overall, we can conclude that dependent and independent variables are not strongly correlated with each other in this model.
Thirdly, we also run 2 tests for hetero. First one is white test. Overall, all p-value 0.708, 0.6271, and 0.9726 are above the 10% level. This means we do not reject the null hypothesis, indicating no evidence of hetero. In other words, the error variance is consistent across observation. This supports the model stability and reliability. Since we do not reject nulls, we also can accept alternative. Overall, the model satisfies the assumptions of equal variance. Next is Bruch-Pagan test. In our model, where consumer spending is our dependent variable, the Bruch-Pagan test returns a p-value of 0.8958. Since this is well above 10% significant level, we do not reject the null hypothesis. This means the error variance is constant, indicating no signs of hetero. Therefore, the model is stable and its result can be considered reliable.
Regression analysis. GDP has a coefficient of negative 3.38 billion, p-value 0.4283, and the interest rate has a coefficient of negative 7.33 billion, p-value of 0.1177, which both are insignificant, while inflation shows a coefficient of negative 21.2 billion, p-value 0.0907, indicating a weak negative relationship that is only marginally significant at the 10% level. The F-test result has a p-value of 0.197, meaning the variables do not jointly have a significant effect on the consumer spending. The R-squared values is only explain 15.6% of the variation in the consumer spending, and the adjusted R-squared is only at 6.23%, and overall, the model meets most of the assumptions but has weak explanatory power.
Next, we discussed about multi-collinearity test. In this test, using variance inflection factor, all VIF values are well below the common threshold of 5. This indicates no serious multi-collinearity among the independent variables. Since the variables are not highly correlated, the regression model is more reliable and stable, especially in estimating the coefficients accurately.
This study examined how GDP growth, inflation rate, and interest rates affect the consumer spending in Malaysia from 1996 to 2024. Only inflation showed a marginally significant negative impact at the 10% level. However, the model explained that 15.6 of the spending variation suggesting of non-economic factors may play a stronger role.
For the recommendation, the future researchers should expand the dataset by using longer time series and more additional variables. Next, using primary data collection is also encouraged to explore behavioral influences. The policymakers should strengthen the financial literacy initiatives to address the overspending, and not only that, improving the economic data for agencies like the OSM would enhance the research quality. And lastly, digital trends reshape consumer behavior, therefore regulatory framework should be updated regularly.
To conclude, this study examines the effects of GDP growth rate, interest rate, and inflation rate on the consumer spending in Malaysia. All three factors shows a negative relationship, but only inflation had a marginally significant impact at the 10% levels. Although the model passed all diagnostic tests, the explanatory power has low with an R-square of just 0.156, likely due to the small sample size. Future studies should include more factors like employment rate, income, and consumer confidence to improve accuracy and insights.
Thank you for watching and listening to our presentation. We hope it gave you insight into the factor that influence consumer spending in Malaysia. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.